From actual world champions to those who are just in it to cause some chaos, here are the most aggressive drivers in Formula One right now. And first is the reigning champ, Max Verstappen. He came into the sport as a teenager and was arguably one of the most aggressive drivers on the grid. Not only was he notorious for shoving drivers off the track and barging through, but he was also just not a great teammate. I mean, we all remember his fights with Daniel Ricciardo, right? It was almost as if they had magnets on their cars as they just kept crashing into each other. Back then, people said it was because he was immature and just needed some extra experience to hone his racecraft. Well, it's been almost a decade, and his aggression hasn't really gone away. Take his battle with Hamilton in 2021, for example. Sure, the Brit was also at fault for some of the crashes like Silverstone, but most people would agree that Max was just way too aggressive during other incidents like the one in Monza. In fact, it kinda became an assumption that if you want to overtake the Dutchman on track, do it on a straight. Because if you meet him at any other point on the track, he's gonna shove you off. Or, well, crash into you. Sure, his fights against Danny Ric during his early days were intense, but both drivers were going at each other in that instance. These days, it's almost like Max just refuses to allow any space for overtaking. At Silverstone last year, we saw Mick Schumacher battle him for what? P8? And if Mick hadn't yielded, I'm sure they would have crashed into each other. That's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Max's aggression though, because he has a habit of fighting and causing issues. Oh, and I've got the perfect example of that as well. Just rewind back to the Brazilian Grand Prix in 2018. Ocon was trying to unlap himself from behind, and Max just didn't see him in his side mirrors. So, of course, he turned right into the apex, causing a crash and ruining his own race. But it was Max's reaction that really made headlines. After finishing the race, the Dutchman didn't hold back at all. Nope, he hopped out of his car and went straight for Ocon, who was getting himself weighed. And mere moments later, Max was shoving the Frenchman. Seriously, the dude was ready to throw hands. But as I've already mentioned, his feisty behavior extends to his own teammates as well. I mean, with Danny Ric, you had the excuse of him being a teenager. These days, no chance. His current teammate, Sergio Perez, played an instrumental role in his first championship. And yet, when the team asked Verstappen to let the Mexican pass through to P6 just so he could get second place in the championship, also, at that point, Max had already won the title, so he had nothing to lose either. Well, apparently he did, because he just refused to let his teammate through. Now, you could say he was doing it because of Perez's crash in Monaco, but still, it was just incredibly petty behavior. That said, he's not the only driver on the grid known for his aggressive behavior. After all, Kevin Magnussen has had his fair share of fights as well. In fact, this was one of the reasons why he was released from Haas in 2020, only to return in 2021. Of course, K-Mag isn't a world champion like Max, which is why people tend to be even more forgiving when it comes to his aggression. I mean, if you're not winning even after shoving other drivers off the track, then there's no reason to do it, right? And, well, that's sort of been Magnussen's career in the sport. Take the 2017 Hungarian Grand Prix, for example. He was racing in 11th and was about to be overtaken by Nico Hülkenberg. But rather than being fair and leaving space on the straight, he just went ahead and shoved Nico onto the grass. Oh, and I don't even have to explain why that was bad. Like, pushing people off on corners is bad enough. Doing it on the straight? That's actually dangerous. That wasn't the end of it, though. During post-race interviews, Nico approached K-Mag, saying he was the most unsporting driver on the grid. Now, maybe he was expecting an apology or something. The Dane, however, opted for his typically aggressive response and said, "Suck my balls." Yeah, classy guy. Now, to be fair, He has improved a lot over the years and isn't nearly as immature these days. One driver who doesn't seem to be changing his aggressive ways, though, is Lance Stroll. He's one of those drivers that go under the radar for their aggressive driving. Not because he doesn't get into crashes, it's just that he usually takes himself out with his driving. Of course, the majority of people focus on the fact that his father is a billionaire team owner, meaning he's got a permanent seat on the grid. But let's be fair, he's no Nicholas Latifi. With that said, he just has a habit of losing focus during a race and getting into really dumb crashes. In Australia last year, for instance, Latifi was just trying to get ahead for some clear space. And for some bizarre reason, Stroll just turned into him without looking into his side mirrors. However, of course, it's not like he hasn't had incidents where he's been overly aggressive either. The most recent example that comes to mind is his crash with Alonso in Austin last year. Not only did he push the Spaniard off the track, but he turned into him on the straight, which, of course, led to a pretty massive crash. Oh, and let's not forget all the times he's collided with other drivers, including Vettel and Verstappen. As bad as Stroll can be, though, he's still perhaps not as aggressive as a driver who's mastered the dark arts. Yep, I'm talking about Fernando Alonso. The two-time world champion is easily one of the most talented drivers in the history of the sport, and he's arguably the best when it comes to pure racecraft as well. I mean, the dude is 41 and still on top of his game. And yet, he's just got this habit of maybe pushing the limit of what's legal and what isn't. Sure, he's a great racer and doesn't leave any space for an opponent to overtake him. But at the same time, he can get too aggressive, leading to some massive crashes. Like the time he ran straight into the back of Esteban Gutierrez at 300 kilometers per hour during the 2016 Australian Grand Prix. Though, usually he's pretty good at keeping it clean and giving enough space to his opponents for a hard-fought battle. A driver who isn't good at doing that, though, is, of course, Yuki Tsunoda. I mean, he's only been in Formula One for a little over 2 years, and yet, it almost feels like he's had the most crashes and incidents as compared to anyone else. Now, you could chalk that down to his lack of experience, or maybe the fact that he just can't see very well because of his short height. The reality is that he's arguably the most incident-prone driver out there, and the second he tries to be aggressive, he ends up taking someone out. His crash with Danny Rick at the Mexican Grand Prix last year is a prime example of this. He knew the Honey Badger was on the inside and had the apex to himself. But rather than taking a wider line and leaving room for the other car, Yuki decided to turn into him, which, of course, led to his retirement from the race. And those, folks, were some of the most aggressive drivers in Formula One.